Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Wednesday, January 21st, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. The high in Riverside today is 70 degrees, with a low dipping to around 52 degrees, so it's a mild winter day perfect for getting out and enjoying the fresh air. Coming up, we'll examine why President Trump is taking the Federal Reserve to court over its independence and break down how a huge funding package has triggered widespread turmoil in U.S. immigration policy. Plus, other key stories on global tensions, tech innovations, and local impacts. All this and more coming up on Alex's News. Stay tuned. The Supreme Court is hearing a blockbuster case this morning that could change how presidents deal with the Federal Reserve. It is called Trump versus Cook, and it goes to the heart of the Fed's independence. Ethan, walk us through what is at stake here.
Grace, this case is essentially about whether President Trump can fire a Federal Reserve governor he does not like, and do it quickly. Specifically, he is trying to remove Governor Lisa Cook over alleged mortgage fraud from 2021, long before she joined the Fed. According to ABC News, the hearing that started at 10 o'clock this morning could rewrite a tradition of more than 112 years that keeps the Fed insulated from day-to-day politics. NPR's Nina Totenberg described it today as, quote, showdown time, end quote, for the central bank's autonomy, with Wall Street in what she called near panic.
For people who do not follow the Fed closely, who is Lisa Cook and why is her seat so important?
Lisa Cook is a prominent economist and, as NPR has often noted, the first black woman ever to serve on the Federal Reserve Board. President Biden put her on the board in May of 2022 for a 14-year term that runs through 2036. She votes on interest rates as part of the Federal Open Market Committee, which has been navigating post-pandemic inflation and new tariff shocks. Because her term is long and protected, it is one of the clearest symbols of the Fed's supposed independence from any one president.
What exactly did President Trump accuse her of that led to this firing attempt?
The allegations come from her 2021 mortgage applications for homes in Ann Arbor, Michigan and Atlanta, Georgia. Bill Pulte, whom Trump installed as head of the Federal Housing Finance Agency, claims she improperly listed both properties as her primary residence on loan documents, including the standard Form 1003. According to ABC News, Pulte says that let her get lower interest rates, around 3.25%, and smaller down payments than if they had been labeled vacation or rental homes. He also pointed to some inconsistent descriptions of a Cambridge, Massachusetts property on older financial disclosures, suggesting a pattern of misleading statements.
And her team is flatly denying that. What evidence do they point to?
Her lawyers, led by former Solicitor General Paul Clement, say the accusations are built on cherry-picked paperwork. NPR reported that a May 2021 loan estimate for the Atlanta condo explicitly lists it as a vacation home, not a primary residence. On her National Security Sulfur Monofluoride 86 form, she called it a second home, and local tax records in Fulton County and Ann Arbor show she never claimed the special homestead tax exemption that homeowners usually take on their main residence. Another attorney, Abe Lowell, told Attorney General Pam Bondi in a letter last November that this all stems from, quote, one stray reference, end quote, with no intent to deceive.
And just to be clear, all of this behavior is from before she ever joined the Federal Reserve, right?
Exactly, it is all pre-Fed conduct, which is a big part of the legal fight. The Justice Department opened an investigation last September, but as of this morning, there are still no criminal charges against Cook. Reuters and the Associated Press, in reports picked up by Yahoo Finance, found that several Trump officials had very similar multi-property mortgage filings without any accusations of fraud. ProPublica went further late last year, noting that even some of Bill Pulte's relatives had comparable loans, which critics say makes this look like selective enforcement aimed at a political target.
So how did we get from those mortgage complaints to the Supreme Court in just a few months?
In August of last year, Trump announced on his social media platform and in a formal letter that he planned to remove Cook, claiming he had cause under Section 10 of the Federal Reserve Act. That law only allows firing a governor for inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance in office, not just because a president dislikes their policy views. In September, U.S. District Judge Giacab blocked the move with a preliminary injunction, saying Cook has a protected property interest in finishing her term and had been given no meaningful notice or hearing, which raised Fifth Amendment due process problems. A divided D.C. Circuit panel upheld that ruling in December, so the administration rushed to the Supreme Court, asking for emergency relief to oust her immediately.
Let's dig into the arguments. What is the Trump administration telling the justices today?
Solicitor General D. John Sauer is arguing that even if the allegations are unproven, they show Cook is fundamentally unfit to help oversee the nation's financial system. According to ABC News, review of the filings, he calls her conduct, quote, grossly negligent at best and fraudulent at worst, end quote, and says that is enough to satisfy a for cause standard. He also leans on the Constitution's Article 2, saying the executive power belongs to the president, so courts should not second-guess his decision about whether a top financial regulator is trustworthy. And he is invoking earlier wins like the Sela Law case and Collins versus Yellen to argue that strong limits on presidential removals of regulators are constitutionally suspect.
And what is Lisa Cook's legal team putting forward in response?
They are saying Congress meant, for cause, to be very narrow and focused on misconduct while in office, not old disputes that can be turned into political weapons. NPR explained that Paul Clement argues in his briefs that dredging up pre-appointment allegations is just a pretext for Trump's pressure campaign to force deeper rate cuts. Her side also argues due process. The president is essentially trying to take away a fixed, statutory term without any formal finding of wrongdoing. And they contend that the Fed's unusual structure, a multi-member, self-funded board that is partly quasi-private, puts it squarely within the older Humphreys executor precedent that allows for-cause protections.
You mentioned earlier another Supreme Court case that carved out special treatment for the Fed. Can you explain that in plain English?
Last May, in a case called Trump versus Wilcox, the court's conservative majority said the president can remove members of some boards, like the National Labor Relations Board, essentially at will. But as The Guardian and the Yale Journal on Regulation pointed out, the justices went out of their way to describe the Fed as, quote, a uniquely structured quasi-private entity, end quote, that might justify stronger insulation. Law professors Daniel Tarullo at Harvard and Lev Menand at Columbia, in briefs and interviews with the New York Times, argue that this Fed carve-out should protect Cook now. They also warn that the court's broader push toward a so-called unitary executive, seen in Collins versus Yellen, could tempt some justices to trim back that protection.
Have we gotten any hints today from the justices? Questions about which way they are leaning?
Early reporting from SCOTUS Blog's live coverage says Justice Kavanaugh is probing whether there can be a, quote, Fed-only exception, end quote, that preserves the central bank's independence without opening the floodgates for every agency. That suggests at least some conservatives are searching for a middle ground that avoids detonating markets. NPR's Nina Totenberg emphasized that the 6-3 conservative majority has been aggressive in expanding presidential power, but appears unusually cautious here. She said the tension in the room reflects that anything threatening the Fed's autonomy could send shockwaves through the economy.
Let's talk about those economic shockwaves. Why are markets so rattled by this particular case?
Investors worry that if Trump can fire a Fed governor on thin cause, he can effectively scare or purge anyone who resists his push for rapid rate cuts. According to ABC News and NPR, there is already concern about stagflation, with stubborn inflation and high borrowing costs together. Yahoo Finance, republishing analysis from The Street, warned that turning the Fed into what they called a partisan tool could erode confidence in the dollar worldwide and drive up long-term treasury rates. This morning, CTV News and Investing.com report Dow futures down more than 1% and 10-year yields bumping higher as the arguments wrap up.
Where does Fed Chair Jerome Powell fit into all of this?
Powell showed up at the court today, which the Associated Press and Yahoo Finance both noted as a striking visual of the central bank's leadership watching its own fate. He is also under pressure himself. The Justice Department subpoenaed documents on January 9th over his testimony last June about major renovations to the Fed's historic headquarters, the first big overhaul since the 1930s. In a recent social media video, Powell called that probe a pretext tied to Trump's frustration that the Fed has not slashed rates to the president's 1% target. The Fed did cut rates 3 times late last year, but then paused because inflation was still running hot, especially after new tariffs raised import prices.
If Trump wins this case, how does that reshape his influence over the Fed, practically speaking?
Removing Cook would let Trump install another loyalist on the 7-member board, giving him a solid conservative majority when combined with his earlier appointees. NPR notes that would significantly increase his leverage over rate decisions ahead of the next election cycle. On top of that, Jerome Powell's term as chair ends in May of this year, though he can remain a governor until 2028. So a ruling for Trump could open the door to a rapid remaking of the Fed's leadership and philosophy.
What are economists and business leaders saying about the broader risks here?
Many are drawing parallels to the 1970s, when political meddling in monetary policy helped fuel runaway inflation. Reuters quoted J.P. Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon, warning that heavy-handed interference could backfire with, quote, reverse consequences, end quote, like higher borrowing costs and weaker investment. 3 former Fed chairs, Alan Greenspan, Ben Bernanke, and Janet Yellen, along with 5 former Treasury secretaries from both parties, filed a friend of the court brief urging the justices to reject Trump's position. According to ABC News, summary, they argued undercutting the Fed's independence would damage faith in U.S. institutions and ultimately raise costs for households and businesses.
Looking ahead, what outcomes are legal experts preparing for?
Forbes and several major law firms sketched out 3 main possibilities. One is that the court doubles down on last year's Wilcox carve-out, clearly shielding the Fed and upholding the injunction that keeps Cook in her seat. Another is a middle ground that technically preserves for cause language but lets presidents define cause so broadly that almost any controversy, even pre-appointment allegations, can justify removal. The most dramatic option would be scrapping those protections altogether, effectively putting the Fed under at-will presidential control, which few analysts think the court will fully embrace.
And which of those seems most likely right now?
John Faust, an economist at Johns Hopkins quoted by Reuters, predicts some kind of erosion in the middle, not a total collapse of independence. In his view, the court's recent trajectory on presidential power makes a complete win for Cook and the Fed less likely. Loretta Mester, the former Cleveland Fed president who now teaches at Wharton, told reporters that even a narrow expansion of cause would, quote, open the door, end quote, to more politically motivated removals in the future. The fear is that once that door is cracked, future presidents of either party will be tempted to push it wider.
Put this in historical context for us. Have presidents tried to lean on the Fed like this before?
They have, but mostly behind the scenes. Federal Reserve history and Econofact note that Franklin Roosevelt reshaped the board in the 1930s Banking Act to get allies like Mariner Eccles, and Harry Truman browbeat Chair Thomas McCabe into resigning in 1951, leading to the famous Treasury Fed Accord. Lyndon Johnson physically cornered Chair William McChesney Martin at his Texas ranch to demand lower rates, and Richard Nixon used Oval Office pressure on Chair Arthur Burns ahead of the 1972 election, a big factor in the Great Inflation. Ronald Reagan later sidelined Paul Volcker by stacking the board with supply-siders more sympathetic to the White House.
So given that history, what makes Trump's move feel different to scholars?
The big difference is that Trump is not just jawboning the Fed chair in private. He is formally trying to fire an individual governor over alleged misconduct that happened before she took office. According to Marketplace's coverage, that opens the door to something like permanent opposition research on every central banker, with any old paperwork dispute potentially weaponized as cause for removal. If the court says that is acceptable, it effectively normalizes what some scholars call skeleton digging as a tool of monetary policy. That is why many central bank veterans say this case is less about Lisa Cook personally and more about the institution's long-term credibility.
Where does the Justice Department investigation into Cook herself stand while all this plays out?
At the moment, it is in a kind of limbo. The DOJ opened its probe in September of last year after Polte's referral, but outlets like NPR and the Associated Press note that prosecutors have not brought any charges or even signaled they are close. Cook's lawyers argue that makes Trump's rush to fire her especially troubling because it bypasses the normal fact-finding process. And the contrast with those uninvestigated, similar mortgages held by Trump officials feeds the perception that this is more about pressure on the Fed than about policing mortgage forms.
When should we expect the Supreme Court to actually issue a decision? And what are people abroad watching for?
Because this is an emergency appeal, the justices could issue a short order within weeks deciding whether Cook can stay in place while the full case continues. Most court watchers, including CBS News and The Guardian, expect a full written decision by late June of this year, when the court usually wraps its term. Foreign investors and central bankers are paying close attention, from the World Economic Forum gatherings in Davos to trading floors in London and Asia. They are asking whether the United States will still have an apolitical central bank, which has been one cornerstone of the dollar's global dominance.
While they wait, what is the Fed saying and doing publicly to steady the ship?
Officials are carefully saying they will follow whatever the court decides, but also stressing that their decisions are driven by economic data, not politics. That dual message, reported by outlets like CBS and Yahoo Finance, is meant to reassure both markets and the public. Behind the scenes, people close to the Fed told The Washington Post they are gaming out contingency plans for different rulings, including how to communicate if there is sudden turnover on the board. The aim is to avoid any sense of panic that might itself move markets or unsettle inflation expectations.
Last thing, Ethan, for listeners trying to follow this without getting lost in the legal jargon, what is the one big thing to watch next?
Watch for whether the court's first move, even before the full opinion, keeps Cook in her job, or lets Trump remove her right away. That early signal will tell you how seriously the justices take the risks to Fed independence. Then, in the final opinion, look at how narrowly they write it. Do they insist this is a, quote, Fed-only exception, end quote? Or do they leave language that future presidents can use against other independent regulators too? That will determine whether Trump versus Cook becomes a narrow dispute over one governor, or a turning point in how much control presidents have over the entire administrative state.
A huge case with a lot riding on it for the economy. Ethan, thanks for breaking it down for us. Chloe, this morning we're looking at how immigration enforcement has changed in a huge way under President Trump's second term. Bring us up to speed on what the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill has done to ICE as of today.
Grace, it has completely remade ICE. According to Department of Homeland Security budget documents and analyses from the Congressional Budget Office, ICE now has roughly $85 billion in available funds for this fiscal year, counting a giant supplemental pot of money. That translates into annual spending in the high $20 billion to roughly $30 billion range, which NPR notes is more than the combined budgets of the FBI, the Drug Enforcement Administration, and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives. CBS News has been calling ICE, quote, the highest funded U.S. law enforcement agency in American history, end quote.
That is an enormous jump. How did this one law manage to deliver that kind of money, and who pushed it through?
The law is officially Public Law 119-21, but everyone from the White House to the Brennan Center for Justice still calls it the One Big Beautiful Bill, or OBBBA, after President Trump's catchphrase. It started as House Resolution 1, the Republicans' marquee bill in the 119th Congress, and it passed the Senate on a razor-thin 51-50 vote, with Vice President J.D. Vance breaking the tie. Because they used the budget reconciliation process, Republicans could move it without needing Democratic votes in the Senate. The Washington Post points out that it runs more than 1,000 pages and bundles together immigration crackdowns, tax changes, and cuts to social programs in one massive package.
Let's drill into the immigration piece. What does this bill actually fund ICE to do on the ground?
The heart of it is what the administration brands the Big Beautiful Deportations campaign, which DHS documents describe as aiming for roughly 1 million removals every year. To do that, the OBBBA sets aside about $30 billion to grow ICE's workforce, allowing the agency to bring on around 10,000 new agents, attorneys, and support staff. PBS NewsHour reports that amounts to more than a 120% increase over the pre-Trump baseline, adding over 12,000 people in total by early this year, once contractors and temporary hires are counted. There is also roughly $45 billion dedicated to expanding detention, with the goal of more than doubling available beds from about 41,500 to well over 100,000, possibly approaching 125,000 beds if all the contracts and new family residential centers come online.
And where are all those extra detention beds actually going to be?
A lot of them are not in federal facilities. DHS contracting records, summarized by outlets like The Guardian, show the money flowing to for-profit prison companies, county jails, and a new network of so-called family centers designed to hold parents and children together. The bill also supercharges the controversial 287 grams program, which deputizes local police to act as immigration agents. Governing.com and Iowa Public Radio both report that more than 1,255 local jurisdictions have now signed agreements, which dramatically expands ICE's reach into day-to-day policing.
So immigration is the headline, but you mentioned tax changes and cuts. What else did Congress tuck into this bill to pay for all of this?
The tax side is very generous to many businesses and higher-income households. The law makes the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent, something conservative groups like the America First Policy Institute had pushed for, and it adds new deductions for tipped wages, overtime pay, and even auto loan interest on vehicles assembled in the United States. It also creates tax-exempt Trump accounts that parents can open for newborns, which supporters pitch as a patriotic version of a college savings plan. To help offset those costs on paper, the bill cuts Medicaid spending by about 12% and tightens work requirements for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP.
How big are those safety net cuts in real terms? Who's most likely to feel them?
According to estimates from the Congressional Budget Office, cited by the Center for American Progress, those Medicaid reductions could eventually push about 10.9 million people off health coverage or into skimpier plans. The expanded work rules for SNAP, which the Department of Agriculture is phasing in this year, could affect up to 2 million low-income adults who struggle to document enough hours or who live in areas with unstable work. On top of that, there is a new 1% excise tax on money sent abroad in remittances, which IRS guidance confirms applies to many transfers used by immigrants to support family in other countries. The Guardian's investigations have highlighted the burden that remittance tax places on migrant communities already wary of contact with federal agencies.
Supporters say this is about security and jobs. Are they pointing to any measurable results yet?
They are. The America First Policy Institute and several Republican lawmakers have been touting early data suggesting that fentanyl overdose deaths have ticked down in some regions, and that wages for lower-income workers have inched up. Economists at Brookings, though, caution that it is extremely hard to separate the impact of immigration enforcement from broader economic trends or state-level drug policies. And the same Congressional Budget Office projections that Republicans use to defend the bill's growth forecasts also show the law adding about $2.8 trillion to the federal deficit by 2034, which has even some fiscal conservatives uneasy.
All of this might have stayed a policy debate if not for what happened in Minneapolis. Walk us through the shooting that pushed this into the streets.
2 weeks ago, on January 7th, ICE launched what it called Operation Metro Surge in the Twin Cities, sending more than 3,000 agents into neighborhoods that had resisted prior raids. According to the Associated Press, agents focused heavily on Somali and Latino communities in South Minneapolis, using unmarked vehicles and heavily armed special response teams that the OBBBA helped fund. During that operation, a 37-year-old U.S. citizen named Renee Nicole Macklin Good was shot and killed by ICE agent Jonathan Ross. She was a Colorado-born poet, a devout Christian by her family's account, and a mother of 3 who was working as a community legal observer documenting ICE activity, not as a formal protest organizer.
What does the government say happened, and how does that compare with what independent investigations are finding?
The official line from Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem is that Good was, quote, a domestic terrorist, end quote, who weaponized her car and rammed agents, forcing Ross to fire 3 shots into her vehicle. But video evidence tells a very different story. The New York Times, the Washington Post, and the open-source researchers at Bellingcat have all analyzed bystander footage, plus a leaked clip from Ross's own phone, which appears to show Good's wheels turn sharply to the right, away from the cluster of agents. Those outlets report that Ross was not in her immediate path when he fired, and that his shots came before any contact, prompting a retired ICE agent, Eric Balliet, to tell Reveal News that the agency's new tactics are, in his words, setting up situations that practically invite shootings instead of de-escalation.
That killing has clearly struck a nerve. What has the response looked like in Minneapolis and around the country since then?
Protests under the banner, ICE, Out for Good, have filled streets in the Twin Cities every day for the past 10 days. Minnesota Public Radio describes a huge coalition of immigrant families, Black church leaders, labor unions, and students marching not just against the shooting, but against the entire enforcement apparatus that the OBBBA built. 4 days ago, on January 17th, Governor Tim Walz activated the Minnesota National Guard to secure key sites. But he was very explicit that they remained under state control and were not there to assist ICE. NPR's Up First newsletter reports that, in the background, the Pentagon has put units from the 11th Airborne Division on standby along freeway access points in case President Trump orders federal troops in.
And the White House is openly talking about the Insurrection Act here, right?
Yes. President Trump has repeatedly threatened to invoke the Insurrection Act of 1807 to override state authorities if he decides Minnesota leaders are, in his words, obstructing federal law. The Justice Department has already issued subpoenas to Governor Walz, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, State Attorney General Keith Ellison, and the Mayor of St. Paul, accusing them of getting in the way of ICE officers. CBS News reports that those moves prompted 6 U.S. attorneys in Minnesota to resign in protest, saying privately that they felt the department was being weaponized. Faith leaders, including Episcopal Bishop Rob Hirschfeld, have gone so far as to urge clergy to prepare legal documents like wills because of the risk of violent clashes, and they are backing an economic blackout day, planned for 2 days from now, on January 23rd, when Minnesotans are urged to stay home from work and school.
These confrontations are now moving into the courts too. What are the main legal challenges to this operation and to the OBBBA itself?
There are at least 2 major suits out of Minnesota already. In Ellison v. Department of Homeland Security, filed just 4 days ago, state officials argue that Operation Metro Surge amounts to an unconstitutional federal invasion under the 10th Amendment and violates the so-called anti-commandeering doctrine that the Supreme Court embraced in the 1997 case Prince v. United States, which limits Washington's ability to conscript state officers. Separately, the ACLU of Minnesota has brought a class action case called Hussein and Others versus ICE on behalf of residents like 20-year-old U.S. citizen Mubashir Hussein, alleging widespread Fourth and Fifth Amendment violations. Court filings summarized by Courthouse News Service describe warrantless traffic stops, racial profiling, detentions of citizens, and the use of chemical irritants and so-called less lethal munitions on protesters.
Have judges stepped in at all yet to slow ICE's tactics on the streets?
A federal judge in Minneapolis issued a temporary restraining order on January 16th that limits ICE's use of rubber bullets, tear gas, and other less lethal weapons against demonstrators and bystanders. The Justice Department appealed that order on January 19, calling it, quote, frivolous, end quote, in a filing that really alarmed civil rights lawyers. Adding to tensions, the FBI quickly took over the investigation into Renee Good's killing and sidelined the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, which would normally lead such a probe. Local outlets like Fox 9 and WUSF report that more than a dozen state and county prosecutors have since resigned, accusing the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division of orchestrating a cover-up.
You mentioned the Insurrection Act earlier. How are constitutional scholars looking at the possibility that the Supreme Court might bless this kind of federal response?
Experts at the Brennan Center for Justice and the civic reform site The Fulcrum warn that if courts uphold these deployments, it could fundamentally change how the Insurrection Act is used. Historically, presidents invoked it for extraordinary crises, like Eisenhower sending troops to Little Rock in 1957 to enforce school desegregation, or the federal response to the Los Angeles riots in 1992. What the Trump administration is hinting at now would extend that power into more routine law enforcement conflicts over immigration, letting a president unilaterally label state-level resistance as, quote, unlawful obstruction, end quote. Given the Supreme Court's current conservative majority and its recent embrace of a strong unitary executive and sweeping federal power over immigration, some scholars fear we could be moving toward what one Brennan Center analyst called, quote, martial law for civil administration, end quote, blurring long-standing limits on using the military inside the country.
How are Americans reacting to all of this, especially the shooting and the prospect of troops in the streets?
A new YouGov poll conducted from January 16th through today shows a sharply divided public, but not in ways the White House might like. 56% of respondents said the shooting of Renee Good was not justified, and a slim majority, about 52%, said they opposed deploying federal troops in Minneapolis in support of ICE. Views on the OBBBA itself track closely with party lines, but even some Republicans in the survey expressed concern about the sheer size of ICE's budget and the precedent of using active duty soldiers in domestic policing. NPR and CBS News both note that the Minneapolis crisis has become a kind of national mirror, reflecting broader anxieties about civil liberties, executive power, and what it means to live in a federal system.
When you step back from the daily headlines, Chloe, what's the bigger picture here as we mark 1 year into this second Trump term?
In a sentence, this $85 billion infusion has turned ICE into a central instrument of federal power and exposed the fault lines in American democracy. The law's backers see a tough, comprehensive approach to immigration, crime, and economic nationalism, wrapped into one beautiful bill. Critics, including civil rights groups and many constitutional scholars, see an unprecedented concentration of enforcement capacity in a single agency, paired with cuts to the social programs that cushion vulnerable communities. With key lawsuits already filed and more likely coming from other states, analysts at places like Brookings and the Brennan Center expect the courts to be wrestling with the OBBBA's constitutionality well into late this year and beyond.
A complicated, fast-moving story with real stakes for how this country polices its borders and its streets. Chloe, thanks for walking us through it. Here are some other headlines. Health officials are sounding the alarm as the U.S. finds itself in a very real spot of trouble over measles. South Carolina reported 88 new cases this week, pushing the state's total to 664 in an outbreak that has now spread to at least 9 states, including Washington and Kentucky. Nationally, the CDC has logged 171 cases so far this year, on the heels of 242 infections in 2025, the highest annual count in more than 3 decades. With sustained transmission now past the 1-year mark from the initial Texas outbreak, experts warn the country is on the verge of losing its 26-year measles-free status. That's triggering a fevered policy fight, as some governors and medical professionals accuse federal health officials of dropping the ball on falling vaccination rates and letting misinformation go viral faster than the virus itself. At the Internal Revenue Service, you could say the numbers don't lie, but the jobs sure have. IRS Chief Executive Officer Frank Bisignano has announced a sweeping shakeup of senior leadership just days before tax filing season opens on January 26. Former whistleblowers Gary Shapley and Joseph Siegler are being promoted into prominent posts in criminal investigation and internal consulting, a move turning past critics into current chiefs. It comes after a 26% downsizing roughly 26,000 positions under Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, initiatives that have given the agency a very different kind of crypto vibe. To process returns, the IRS will now farm out paper filings to private contractors and use technology to stitch together aging data systems instead of ripping and replacing its IT backbone. National taxpayer advocate Aaron Collins is warning that these last-minute moves, combined with new rules on tips and overtime relief, could make this season a taxing test for the 164 million Americans expected to file. In South Korea, a court has handed down a sentence that may echo for years through the halls of power. The Seoul Central District Court has sentenced former Prime Minister Han Duck-soo to 23 years in prison for his role in the 12.3 insurrection, the failed December 2024 martial law declaration. The presiding judge ruled that the military deployment ordered by then-President Yoon Suk-yeol amounted to a self-coup aimed at overturning constitutional order, a martial flaw rather than a mere misstep. Han was convicted of rebellion, perjury, and destroying official records after evidence showed he ordered martial law documents backdated and then discarded. Prosecutors had asked for 15 years. But the court went above that, underscoring his duty to stop, not stage, an illegal decree. The ruling is the first to label the crisis a criminal rebellion, setting a powerful precedent ahead of Yoon's own February 19 rebellion trial, where prosecutors are seeking the death penalty and signaling a determined judicial push to head off any future top-down insurrections. In Hong Kong, a landmark national security trial is putting the city's past vigils under a very different kind of spotlight. Opening arguments have begun against former leaders of the Hong Kong Alliance in support of Patriotic Democratic Movements of China, the group that organized the territory's long-running Tiananmen Square candlelight commemorations. Defendants Chow Hang-tung, Lee Chu-kian, and Albert Ho are charged with inciting subversion of state power under the 2020 National Security Law, a crime that can carry a life sentence. On January 21, the High Court issued a detailed ruling refusing Chow's attempt to quash the indictment, despite her argument that it was vague and turned peaceful slogans like "End one-party rule" into criminal evidence. The trial is expected to run about 75 days and is widely seen as the final legal dismantling of the organizers behind the only mass Tiananmen memorials ever permitted on Chinese soil. Chow and Lee have maintained their innocence after more than 500 days in detention, while legal observers note that Albert Ho has previously signaled plans to plead guilty, turning a vigil into a test of how much dissent Hong Kong's courts will still handle. And on the tech front, regulators are trying to unfriend monopoly power. The Federal Trade Commission has filed an appeal seeking to revive its antitrust lawsuit against Meta platforms, aiming to overturn a November 2025 ruling that said Meta wasn't a social networking monopoly given competition from rivals like TikTok. The FTC argues Meta kept its dominance by buying up its biggest threats, including Instagram and WhatsApp, instead of facing the music in the marketplace. Meta counters that the judge was right to recognize today's fierce fight for users' time and taps. The case now moves to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, keeping the possibility of forcing Meta to spin off Instagram and WhatsApp very much in the feed, and setting up a crucial test of how monopoly power is defined in the age of likes, loops, and endless scrolls. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with GPT-5, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.